Hello AP US History. It's been a few days since I did the last video because, as you might be able to see in the background, I actually just moved. So here's the new office, hooray. What this video is going to do is it's going to pick up where we left off on indigenous cultures in the Americas. This video is going to focus on North America, which ultimately I think is going to be more important for you to really pinpoint some specific cultures that have more significant, at least historically significant, encounters with Europeans. But what I want you to take away from this map, and again, I know I'm cutting off a little bit of it, but I'm not going to really worry about that too much, because really what you should be seeing in this map is the degree of diversity that existed among indigenous cultures in the Americas. And one thing that you'll really get hammered into your head as we study this unit is that most Europeans, especially as time went on and they needed more land, tried to oversimplify indigenous cultures by saying that either that they were homogenous, that everyone was exactly the same, they were all sort of an other, so to speak, and also kind of dismissing them as primitive. And what you're going to see, hopefully, as we move on, is that even if their population was smaller than many areas in Europe, they very much developed sophisticated technology. There were areas that had very high population centers, as you already saw in South America, but there were some locations in North America that were very sophisticated. Their understanding of the environment in a lot of ways is a really interesting point of comparison, because when Europeans initially started settling, a lot of times they were very ignorant about the environment that they encountered, and this did lead to eventually things like drought, which actually comes back to hit them hundreds of years later. But I digress. Let's just move on here and highlight some of the key areas that you should be familiar with. So I'm basically going in the order that the textbook goes in, just to hopefully make things a little easy to follow. So let's focus on the Southwest region first. Geographically, where we're looking is the Four Corners region of the U.S. So you are probably familiar with the Pueblo people. They are actually descendants of the Anasazi culture. So as you can see here, the Anasazi culture originated around the 12th century, before the Common Era. So a very old, ancient society. As time went on, actually, environmental pressures, essentially drought, actually caused the Anasazis to move ever so slightly, but most of the Anasazi and then eventually Pueblo cultures were located near the Colorado and also Rio Grande rivers. And what's really fascinating about these cultures is they were able to adapt to what was very much a harsh climate, except, of course, when there was a serious environmental plight, which actually forced them to move. But for the most part, they very much were able to kind of adapt to their desert climate. For example, there is archaeological evidence that these people actually developed irrigation systems. They also had sophisticated ways to store water and store food, so it did not ultimately go bad and cause them to essentially waste. What you see here is the Pueblo structure, which again, you are probably familiar with from previous studies of history, but essentially, as you can see, these are almost apartment-style living complexes. It's also, hopefully it's apparent to you in this image, that also they often took advantage of this natural rocky landscape and developed their apartments in a shaded area, right? These apartments actually rivaled, at least in terms of their structural construction, they rivaled apartments that were built as late as the early 20th century in New York City, for example. So they, as far as technology was concerned, they were very aware of how to build structures that can withstand the test of time. The largest urban center was a place called Pueblo Bonito. The most well-known landmark there is called Chaco Canyon. Essentially, again, like I was saying before, the Anasazi in around the 13th century. Actually, this 13th century CE or Common Era or AD. actually ended up abandoning the initial area of settlement, and now we see the Pueblo peoples have shifted slightly population-wise, are a little bit farther away from the Four Corners area. But what's really fascinating about the Pueblo culture is that there still are Pueblo people that live in the United States. Obviously, the population is much smaller, but some of the Pueblo societies that still exist are actually the oldest continuously occupied towns in the United States. One example of that is Taos, New Mexico, which still has Pueblo people living in it. Shifting geographically a little bit, we can move on to the Ohio Valley and look at the mound building societies. Okay, again, like the Southwest, the peoples that live there evolve over time, right? The way I like to remember the three major societies in the Ohio River Valley is that they actually go in both chronological and alphabetical order, right? See, Adena comes first, A, Hopewell comes second, H, and Mississippians, M, comes third. So I always tell my students they can memorize it that way. The dates, again, these aren't really landmark dates, but maybe you can ballpark when these societies existed. Okay, so all of them have very similar structures to their society because essentially, again, the key idea behind a lot of these indigenous cultures and why they were able to thrive so much is because they adapted to their environment. So the Ohio Valley is not much different from where we live in the Atlantic region. Although New England has a slightly harsher climate, but essentially the Ohio Valley was very conducive to agriculture. The reason why they're called mound builders, by the way, is that they actually built these very interesting earthen mound structures, which may seem primitive in a sense because architecturally they don't really match up to the pyramids of Giza, maybe. Excuse me. But what's really amazing about the mounds is that these societies, hundreds of years ago, were actually able to move mass quantities of dirt and assemble structures. And I think, do I have the serpent mound somewhere? Shoot, I don't, but your textbook does. So take a look at its serpent as in snake mound. There's an image of it in your textbook. And that actually, in a way, is a much more impressive structure because what you see there is, oh, I went all the way to the beginning. Anyway, what you see there is it's actually a mound that's in the shape of a snake. And you can only tell what it looks like from above, from an aerial perspective. And again, think about how amazing that is, that they actually were able to build something huge that they couldn't actually see. It's not like they could get in a plane and look at it. Let me get ahead to where we were. Okay, so again, the mound builders. What were the mounds? They varied in terms of function. One of the most well-known functions of the mounds is that they actually served as tombs for very important leaders. Oh, of course, I get a little happy with my mouse, and then I press it too many times, and then here we go. Okay, anyway, I'm going to sort of talk as I advance slides and advance them a little bit more slowly. Okay, so what you need to also know, the reason why I chose Monk's Mound as the image, which I'll get back to in just a second, is because Monk's Mound was located in Cahokia, which was essentially the capital of the Mississippian culture. Cahokia had a very significant population. The peak population was estimated at about 20,000 people, which again rivaled most European cities at the time. The other fascinating thing about Cahokia is that there is significant evidence of trade throughout the region in some of these mounds and also just in archaeological excavations. The archaeologists actually discovered artifacts that could not have possibly come from that region. So they find seashells that were from the Pacific, right? So basically what you can see is that Cahokia was sort of like this trade center, and it indicates that the Mississippian peoples were interacting across the continent with different linguistic groups. All right, so no major American city, by the way, would have a population as high as Cahokia until the 18th century. So again, when the Europeans came in contact with these peoples, they very much oversimplified them. And Cahokia is located in the Ohio River Valley, which is significantly west of where at least the English first arrived. And so the English really didn't understand the huge populations that they were dealing with. Most of the populations that the English came across were in the Atlantic region, of course, and a lot of those were decentralized. So again, that made them feel like they could conquer them much more easily. Okay, Cahokia is here. Apologies for the delay. So again, you see Cahokia is, it's located close to present-day St. Louis, which again, because of the Mississippi River itself, you can see how massive the trade networks actually were. Okay, another thing that's interesting about this region before I move on is that you have archaeological evidence also of a strong political system. You had evidence of a hierarchy that existed. Only people of prominent status would be buried in these mounds. Again, really extensive trade networks, and you also saw evidence of labor diversification, right? Especially gender diversification of labor, which of course existed in European societies. They're going to come across that. Albeit it was different in some ways, but still the Europeans would come across that. Okay, moving on to the south. What I tell my students, the most important not most important, that sounds terrible, but on the AP exam, the tribes that you should remember, if you forget everything, are what eventually are going to be called the civilized tribes, right? Almost all of them start with a C, so that makes it easy to remember too. I like to have my students remember the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Creek, as well as the Seminole. One of them doesn't start with a C, but the Seminole actually aren't labeled in this map, but they were located in northern Florida, which actually was settled by Spain at first. Okay, but what's interesting about these societies, first off, is that we don't have as strong of a historical record, and the reason why that is because they came across Europeans earlier because they were located on the coast. And this meant that they died off faster due to disease. But nonetheless, we're going to see significant encounters between these southern populations and the Europeans going into the 19th century with Indian removal and Andrew Jackson, which we'll talk about quite a bit when the time comes. Okay, they're less centralized in the mound building society, which again made them vulnerable to the European population. And of course, the very first society that the English came across actually was the Powhatan Nation in Virginia, so it's a little bit north of here, but still nonetheless we kind of see why geographically these cultures were most vulnerable to Europeans. And then we move on to the Northeast, which also, of course, encountered the Europeans earlier because they were on the coast. Okay, the Iroquois and Algonquin are the two major language groups that exist in the Northeast, as well as parts of the Ohio River Valley. There's a little bit of an overlap in culture with the Mississippi mound builders. The Iroquois were mostly located in present-day upstate New York. Many of the Finger Lakes are named after them. Okay, we can see them here. All right, so the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, Mohican, those are some major ones. The Huron, of course, the Iroquois themselves along the St. Lawrence River. What's really interesting about this society is that they were matrilineal, which meant that the family descended by the mother's bloodline, right? So actually when a couple got married, the father would leave his family and come join the family of his wife. Now, the Algonquin, which actually were rivals of the Iroquois, they were located closer to the coast for the most part, and some of them a little bit farther south, but you also had, like, the Pequots, for example, which we know well, being in Connecticut, were located, of course, along the Connecticut coast. Now, the Algonquin society was a patrilineal society, which was more familiar to Europeans. But again, what we're going to see is that at first the Iroquois wanted to form a political alliance to defend themselves against other indigenous tribes, right? So we see the Iroquois Confederacy was formed in 1451, which was, of course, before European contact. But what we're going to see is that's very much going to come in handy when the Europeans arrive in the Americas because the Iroquois already have a way to defend themselves. Okay, so that sort of wraps up our talk about at least an introduction of these indigenous cultures. We'll, of course, talk about them a little bit more in class once the school year starts. But over the summer, if you're very ambitious, you have these videos to get started. Okay, if you have any questions about anything, feel free to send me an email. I am checking it. you'll find that I'll give an out of office reply once I leave in a couple of weeks. Bye.